So that's kind of the gist of what you need to write down for that. Okay, the next bunch of slides, it's more so just for review. Okay, so you should look these over as well when you get home. Okay. There's a lot here. Anyways, this is going to go through a bit of the history here. So European groups, particularly after the late 1400s, 1500s, as they started settling in Canada, they're bringing their conflicts over with them, right? It's not that different than like if you and your sibling get into a fight at the house, and then your family has to drive somewhere. You're probably still going to be in disagreement when you're in the car. Maybe you're not going to be happy with one another when you get to your destination. So the same thing happened in 1701. The same thing happened in Canada's history. In 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal was signed by New France and 40 Indigenous groups to end a long period of conflict. There have been 5 phases of treaty making between Indigenous peoples. You don't need to take notes on these slides. Okay. This will also be posted on Google Classroom, so you can read and review this yourself. There have been 5 phases of treaty making between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. There's peace and friendship treaties, Robinson treaties, Douglas treaties, the numbered treaties, okay, and modern treaties. So the people who have settled this land have been in talks and agreements and negotiated with Indigenous peoples from 1700s. Okay. Each of these phases were driven by economic, political, social dynamics that emerged. And as their relationships shifted, so early on, the settlers, the people who came across from Europe, they didn't really know what to do in North America. They perhaps didn't know how to survive. I don't know if any of you know anything about Europe. It doesn't get very cold there. Everywhere in Canada gets miserably cold for several months of the year. There's lots of snow. There's different animals. Okay, it's just a different climate and environment. So that relationship shifted over time when the people who were settling started figuring out how to survive on their own and maybe weren't as dependent on Indigenous peoples for help. Initially, they're creating military alliances and trade partners. So for many European people, the fur trade wouldn't have happened if Indigenous people didn't participate in it. And part of the reason they might have participated in the fur trade was because they were trading furs for things that were very valuable, like metal tools, metal items, tobacco or alcohol as well was something that people really wanted at the time. Okay. Eventually, there's a desire to secure ownership. So again, there's competing forces, right? Between the European monarchs, and then there's competition with Indigenous groups as well, and all of this is very complicated relationships get created there. Treaties continued to be signed. The government believed they ended Indigenous ownership of land, but Indigenous peoples believed they were agreeing to share the land. I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it. It's not obvious or clear to me if this is also a historical understanding or if this is a modern take on what had happened with the treaties. It's an area that I need to do more research in, but definitely 10, 15, 20 years ago, they didn't talk nearly as much about this idea that Indigenous people didn't know what they were signing on to. Whereas in the last 10, 15 years, it's gained a lot of traction. The numbered treaties became Canada's legal process to extinguish Aboriginal ownership of land as the fur trade ended and bison herds declined. Decline is the wrong word to use there. Decimated would be better. So bison populations, like they were. Have you kids ever seen those photos of like mountains of skulls of bisons, right?
And
so
there's like a guy standing like on top of it.
Yeah, right. And
he looks so proud.
He does. It's quite a bit. Now it's not obvious or clear to me if that all happened like in a 2, 3, 4 month span, but over 50 to 100 years, just bison, their population was decimated, didn't decline, right? It's not like a natural process. Okay. Indigenous people knew that engaging in the settler states' new economies of agriculture, ranching, mining, forestry provided an avenue for income and survival. Okay. So I mentioned it before, many Indigenous groups, they were looking out and trying to figure out how to survive. In exchange, they got some reserve lands, some annuities, so some agreements. They were allowed to continue practicing their way of life. So if they wanted to hunt and fish, right, whatever that is, whatever it is they wanted. Education as well, which, as we know, went horribly wrong for many people. Indigenous peoples were encouraged to settle on reserve lands to build permanent communities and adopt agriculture. So these are two very drastically different ways of life. You have nomadic peoples where they don't have a one set place, they move around. And then you have people who are settled or agricultural, right? Nomadic people also tend to be hunter-gatherers, so they're hunting their food, they're gathering things rather than growing it. Okay? Whereas agricultural societies, they settle in one spot, they grow their food, and they amass wealth, and like the societies functions quite differently. And it's kind of challenging to have both of these societies running at the same time. Like there's a few hunter-gatherer groups left in the world today, to this day. Some of them are in Africa, some of them are in South America. And when you watch shows about how they kind of deal with things, it's I watched a hunting show. This guy went down to South America, and many of these hunter-gatherers, they kind of fascinating. The guy talked about how they still had some of their old ways of living. So in South America, they practice this thing called, well, many cultures do this, called shamanism. And so the guy who hosts the show was explaining that while he was there, like their shaman was like praying and having like a spiritual battle with another tribe's shaman to like protect their tribes and whatnot. Very different way of living, right? Additionally, these people, they hunt all their food. They produce all of their things themselves, what they need, right? But then they still have modern connections as well. So it's very complicated to have these two completely different ways of life living at the same time. But part of signing the treaties was that getting Indigenous people to agree that they would stay on a certain set area of land, the reserves, and not move around as much and start doing things that were more agrarian, more agricultural style, what Europe and much of the rest of the world was doing. Okay, Indigenous people believed the treaties had a stronger emphasis on shared usage and rights rather than a complete surrender of land. The government's view was that this is a massive surrender of land, and it helped to open up more settlements. So why do we learn about these? Let's get into that. Give me a second, let me just double check. This slide just talks a little bit about the Royal Proclamation as well. I don't really know what that first point is going on about. Okay, we'll just skip on over, just kind of repeating what we've already done. So another thing to note would be that Indigenous and Aboriginal people has experienced a lot more negative outcomes at drastically different rates than, let's say, the regular or the rest of Canadian society faces. So, their suicide rate is very high. There was kids are probably too young to remember this, but a handful of years ago, there was a suicide crisis on a couple of reserves that gained a lot of national attention. In which I learned that the Canadian government spent more money on lawyer fees fighting that tribe than the tribe had asked for funds for suicide prevention. Right? They were having a legal battle of how much the government owed them. They were going back and forth. The tribe requested, like, I don't know, $350,000, let's say, and the government had spent $470,000 on lawyer fees just fighting them. Is kind of ridiculous. Right? Indigenous people are, I don't know, highly represented. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, in prisons. They face a lot of problems. Other Canadians have benefited from the land and resources shared with us in the treaties. No comment. Hopefully the goal is to, create better outcomes for Indigenous peoples, but again, as mentioned before, that can be very challenging when what you're willing and wanting to pursue. So if you live in a very technological society, very modern, let's say, society, it kind of conflicts with the desire to have a more traditional cultural society where people hunt and fish and live off the land and do all that. These things are in conflict. And so, how do you find meaningful ways for people to connect to their own culture, to have healthier outcomes, and just to do better in life? It's not easy. Part of it is a lot of distrust between the government and Indigenous groups. This tends to happen when you have a history of just negative interactions, and so trying to find